In this chapter, we'll discuss principles and theories of learning. So our objectives, we want to compare and contrast learning theories and strategies, differentiate between types of behavioral consequences, specify strategies that enhance long-term memory, describe several learning and teaching styles, define the stages involved in the innovation decision process, and identify the role of technology in learning. So first, defining what is learning. So we have a definition which is a change in a person as a result of experience or interaction of person with his or her environment. And according to cognitive psychologists, they view learning as an active mental process of acquiring, remembering, and using knowledge. So again, the cognitive psychologist approach is much more focused on knowledge, whereas our more broad definition also more looks at behavior and interactions. Now again, what we'd like to see, and again, this is kind of the important thing, is that knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values are transmitted between teachers and learners. And so the biggest one there, so it seemed pretty obvious that knowledge and skills would be transferred, right? That's kind of the goal of what you're trying to transfer, is teach someone how to do something, make sure they know something. But again, one of the things that's most important when we're looking at nutrition and dietetics is how do we transmit attitudes and values? How do you make sure that your patient gains this value of their health, or this value to maintaining this diet and maintaining or preventing their disease process, right? How do you maintain or change that attitude of, I can do it, I can change my diet? And so then the book has this quote that says, teachers must learn about learning before they can effectively teach. And I would say, again, I would agree mostly, except for the fact I would say maybe optimally teach. So again, you can still observe someone do something or suboptimally and still learn and gain knowledge from it. But again, for optimal learning, I think definitely teachers need to learn about learning. And so again, that's kind of one of the big things with college, right, is that your professors, for the most part, are really going to be subject matter experts, as opposed to if you had a degree in teaching, you would be a teaching expert. Now, luckily, right, there are a lot of professional development or additional courses that are offered to help subject matter experts actually learn about learning so they can be more effective teachers. So the first thing the text reviews is behavioral learning theories, and this is kind of an expansion on Chapter 7 that's more focused on the learning itself. So here, explanations of learning are limited to observable changes in behavior. So again, this does not reflect knowledge, attitudes, and values. This isn't how you feel or what you know. This is what you're doing. So there's an emphasis on the effects of external events on an individual's behavior, and then it talks about the different types of rewards and punishments and how this shapes behavior. So it's a real quick review of Chapter 7. Remember, we have Ivan Pavlov with classical conditioning. This is our training our dogs with a bell. This is our unconditioned stimulus and our unconditioned response to a then conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. And we have Edward Thorndike, where again we were looking at the connections between stimuli and the subsequent response or behavior, right, this law of effect, and how this was expanded on by B.F. Skinner with our operant conditioning, so based on rewards. So we have what's known as association theory. So the stimulus event cues or elicits responses from the learner, and teaching or conditioning, right, so again I'm now looking at this from the teaching aspect, involves arranging the stimulus and the response events. So if you do the right thing, you get the rewards, you learn what to do. Now this is a teacher-centered approach with passive learners. So again, the teacher has to set up these situations, right, and then the students experience them. So again, they're not really doing it themselves, they're just experiencing it. So this is considered passive. So again, we have operant conditioning. So again, here we recognize that human behaviors are operants and not merely respondents. And so again, we have the stimulus, the response, and then the reinforcement, with the teacher managing all three events, so they have to also then reinforce behaviors. Again, this is also teacher-centered with a passive learner. Now, the book does talk about our different types of reinforcements, and it gives a little bit more detail than Chapter 7, or really just kind of a different slant to how we refer to them. So our positive reinforcement, again, these are the goal to strengthen and increase the frequency of a behavior. Now again, with things like food, this is the pleasure associated with eating, right? So eating tastes good and makes you feel good. So that's a positive reinforcement from eating. But this is also things like praising a behavior when someone does a good job. Now, for it to be an effective positive reinforcer, the person has to value the reinforcer. So if you don't respect someone or care about their praise, then them praising you has no effect. Or for example, if someone is not driven by financial reward or gain, then money, right, with a job well done, does not improve their performance, right? They might actually need to have some other kind of reinforcer, such as performance evaluations, praise, etc. And so what happens is we also see is that knowledge of results forms as a weaker or secondary reinforcer, which is if somebody knows or sees that they're doing well and they do the correct thing, again, this reinforces their behavior, right? Because they've now gained knowledge or they know something and then they're rewarded. Looking at negative reinforcers or escapes, again, this is escaping from an unpleasant situation. So for example, we're eating to cure loneliness, unhappiness, boredom, etc. Or fatigue. We rest and then we have an escape from the fatigue. And again, getting an escape from something makes it more likely that the behavior will continue. So the person is likely to repeat the action again. So again, a positive reinforcer encourages behavior, and a negative reinforcer still is encouraging the behavior. Not to be confused with punishers, which are unpleasant or adverse consequences, and these should decrease the frequency of or suppress a behavior. Now sometimes punishers, for example, can be the removal of a positive reinforcer. So for example, if someone is docked pay, if someone is scolded and told they did a bad job, etc. The book then talks about extinction. So again, behaviors weaken and disappear if they're not reinforced. So if there's a lack of continuous positive reinforcers, then a behavior stops. Now again, ideally this would happen with a negative behavior. So when somebody is doing something they're not supposed to, we don't reinforce the behavior and it goes away. So they always tell you, for example, when your kids start saying bad words and they don't really know what they mean, but they get a response from you, if you ignore the response and give them no response, the behavior weakens and disappears. Again, that's a lack of continuous positive reinforcement. If the child says the curse word and you then give it lots of response, that encourages, that's a positive reinforcer from the child's point of view, and they will continue the behavior. And so looking at shaping, which is just a fancy way for saying how do we guide this process along. So again, we reinforce each step along the way to successful behaviors. So again, this is just planning those activities of how we reward certain behaviors that then guide us toward a larger behavior pattern or goal. Again, so successive approximations, which is, again, we don't go from 0 to 60, but we reinforce, right, each successful step along the way. So again, exercising twice a week, right, the goal is 5 days a week, but we're praising 2 days a week. Then we get to 3, we continue to praise it, so on and so forth, to continue and encourage the behavior. So goals are broken down into a series of identified steps or sub-skills. Again, you praise and reinforce or punish based on each sub-skill, building to, right, that overall behavior change. And lastly, it talks about timing reinforcement. So again, how do you schedule reinforcement with the client? And again, we talked about this previously in Chapter 7, but for example, early on, we want continuous reinforcement after every correct response. This is when you're training the dog. Sit, here's a treat. Sit, here's a treat. Sit, here's a treat. And then later on, right, so what happens is we have to control this, and so we then lead to intermittent or variable reinforcement, where the dog always responds to sit, but we don't always give a treat. We do some of the time, every now and then, every other. But again, it's always because of that potential for reinforcement, the behavior continues and doesn't become extinct. Next, we have a review of social cognitive theory, which, remember, this is a fancy umbrella for what we're normally referring to, which is modeling, which comes from Albert Bandura. Again, people learn from others' successes and failure. And so again, this is why you'll typically see, again, we talked about the status of the model, right? So again, if somebody is powerful or highly successful, and the similarity of the model. So again, somebody in the same circumstances. Now, you might be familiar with and looking from a counseling standpoint, right? If we're looking at group counseling, here's where this really comes into play. So from a counseling standpoint, right, when you see other people who have overcome the same problem, the techniques they used. So again, people learn from the external cues and from observing models or modeling that behavior. So again, you would take somebody else who overcame a similar problem and came from a similar background, and you would then ideally mimic or model their way to success. We then have our cognitive theories. So again, previously we were focused on observable behaviors, and now we're looking at internal, unobservable mental processes that people use to learn. So this is actually kind of a confusing one in the sense from a research standpoint. We actually don't know how people know things, which sounds kind of strange, but it's actually kind of cool. So again, we have the active internal mental processes of acquiring, remembering, and using knowledge. But the big thing that we do know is that prior knowledge and exposure is an important influence. So what you've seen or learned before plays a big role. So one of the concepts that we have is what's known as discovery learning. It's where people learn through active involvement and, wait for it, discover things for themselves, where again uses experimentation and problem solving. And so in this scenario, right, the teacher in essence creates a guided experience or an experiment where people are learning things by trying things out. So if you wanted to learn about physics, right, this is all those classic physics toys, right, the things that, the continual motion machines, right, where you're actually learning and discovering the concepts by experimenting. All right, so looking at memory, so again, looking at retention of knowledge. So past information is going to be stored in memory. Now, one of the things that helps with memory is that with no prior experience or a perceptual deficit, then a frame must be created. And so you see this really evidently in children. So for example, children have a bad habit of, for example, calling everything with 4 legs and fur dog. It's not until they have a proper frame, pointy ears, claws, cat, or horns, cow, no horns, dog, and you're like, no, 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 not all cows have horns, right? And so what happens is you have to create a frame or context for how this information relates to what you know. So with prior experience, you have a frame, and then you can distinguish or find the minutia that makes the information different. So if your frame is incorrect, again, 4 legs and hairy, dog. No, that's not a dog, that's a cat. You're like, oh, pointy ears, claws, smaller, different frame is created. Now, of course, it's much more complex than that as information becomes more complex, but that process of creating a frame is very evident early on in children, and quite funny usually to observe. With cognition, we also have the rational linguistic learning theory. And so this is reasoning skills allow for the analysis of experiences and prediction of future outcomes, and thoughts precede a person's actions. So again, based on what you've learned previously, you're able to then synthesize and create a new solution or come up with new information or predict things, again, using your previous knowledge. So again, you think about something and then make the action. We have the consumer information processing theory, which states that the consumer takes in and uses information in their decision making, which seems obvious, but instead we're focused on the capacity to process, store, and retrieve information, as we believe that this capacity is limited. So the problem is, if I'm trying to, for example, read a food label and make a food choice, am I looking at calories, fat, saturated fat, sugar, protein, ingredients list, right? Instead, for example, if somebody has limited capacity, I might tell them, for example, if they have diabetes, only focus on carbohydrate content, and then as they gain more knowledge and skills, right, we could then expand, right, and their capacity increases. But if you overwhelm that capacity, right, then people aren't able to make choices. So people need to use enough information to make their choice quickly, but if they become overwhelmed, right, that becomes a more difficult process. Now looking at memory, so again, you'll see that these are some common techniques to gain the learner's attention. So the first step for memory, right, is that we actually have to get the learner to focus on the information being presented. So with media, right, this is things like bright colors. We can use voice inflection, so more interesting things, we start raising or lowering our voice. We can use inflection. You'll notice the infamous gestures, right, the infamous Vanna White gesture for look at this, right, tells people to pay attention. Or again, if you ask a question of the audience, especially an open-ended question, right, this increases audience interest and engages them in the material. The other thing that helps is explaining the purpose. So again, looking at the objectives, for example, or why we're going to be learning this information, or what you're going to be able to do with this information. You'll notice that things are repeated frequently if we want people to retain them. We can also alert people to the fact that this is important, or this is a frequently asked question on the RD exam, right? Kinds of things to help people retain things in memory. And again, asking how the information is useful to the person to focus their attention. So if I'm asking you, well, what do you think you can do with this? Or what's a scenario where you might find this information helpful? Again, that person's now being forced to put it into context for it being useful for them, which then, right, increases their focus and attention because they know it'll be useful to them in the future. Now looking at working memory, or what people might call short-term memory. So again, this is information that's retained for 5 to 20 seconds. And this is your classic repeating it over and over to try and recall something. So again, if you're trying to take somebody's order and you're like, all right, it was a Diet Coke, an unsweet tea, and a root beer, right? And you're a Diet Coke, unsweet tea, root beer, Diet Coke, unsweet tea, root beer. You just keep, and you run and you put your order into the computer and you're good. Now, if we want to help retain something, though, we need to start making associations with long-term memories or pre-existing memories. Or again, we want to group individual bits of information. So whether this be numbers and sequencing, or how the information is related. So for example, it gives some examples in the textbook about looking at things like bacteria, or looking at different types of meals and meal timing, etc. And the other thing that helps is seeing it both written information and then also hearing it, right? So again, this is the classic, if I'm looking at the notes and someone is saying it to me, again, increasing my memory. So long term, we have to attach this new information to other related memories. So again, previously, right, if we're trying to retain something, we keep talking about it, and then there's some examples in the book with looking at vitamins, and there's some blank spots, where again, I could then have my pre-existing frame and attach that information to the frame that already exists. So again, that I have it for long-term storage and can refer back to it, but again, only because I was able to solidify that memory with something that I had pre-existing knowledge of. The other thing that helps with long-term memory is summarizing periodically. So again, this is that continual review. This is going back to and reviewing your notes from foods class, once every couple of months, just making sure I still have looked at and refreshed myself with the information. Again, your classic repetition and review. Handouts, outlines, images, right, things that can make it easier to picture in your mind, right, versus just trying to recall straight words. Presenting the information in a clear and organized fashion. Again, this is the classic thing that you're working on your presentation with, which is a funnel, so broad information to specific. Again, broad information about foods to specific food groups. Again, asking the person to summarize the information, so when you ask the client to teach back or explain what you've taught to me, again, this helps solidify things. And then stories, metaphors, and examples can all help people retain information. You'll notice this is why I usually talk about my patients or other examples that I've had at work, because again, it's much easier to remember the story and why it's important than just trying to recall specific words, names, and definitions for no reason other than for the sake of memory. And so looking at the transfer of learning, so again, people should be able to use the new knowledge and skills to solve problems. So again, the information should actually be usable. Again, just recall that lowest level of Bloom's taxonomy doesn't mean you can do anything with it, right? So learning does not transfer automatically. And so it's enhanced when the teaching takes place in the actual or simulated environment. And so again, this is looking at those objectives. So you should be actually able to, the book talks about the example, at the end of this demonstration, you should be able to demonstrate how to use the cash register, right? So then you would have the person do the thing on the cash register, punch all the buttons, and they're actually doing the thing to retain the knowledge, as opposed to watching a video of someone else using the cash register. Next, the book talks about Andragogy. So you have pedagogy, which is how you teach children. So this is your classic K through 12 and teaching, versus Andragogy, which is recognizing that the way we teach adults is different from the way we teach children, right? Because they are different, especially in the way their minds are developed, what they're looking for in the information. And so, for example, adults, right, they're mutual partners in the learning. So again, Of course, you should always treat anyone that you're teaching with respect, but it's a little bit different in the fact that people are bringing experiences and skills to the table that we're trying to work it with, incorporate into the learning, etc. Now, adults need to become aware of the need to know, which is, for example, the question of, well, why do I need to know this? And so again, this is a little bit different in college or an on-the-job skill training, but again, for better transfer of why is this important? Again, they want autonomy in the learning situation. So again, not having everything controlled for them, having to be able to exert some control over it. And expanding experiences being a growing resource. So again, the fact that they've actually seen more, right? So adults have life experience unlike children. So again, they're able to use that. So those, for example, those transferable soft skills. So if somebody goes from working in retail to being a dietitian, dealing with customers, whether it be in a store or in a hospital when somebody has a complaint about food, right, that's the same skill set. So again, they have that previous experience that's a resource. Again, we're looking at adults' readiness to learn. And so again, this is based on developmental issues in their lives. So again, are they being forced to come to this learning situation? Is this a job training, so something that they've pursued and wanted? Adults are problem-centered, not subject-centered, which is what do I need to know to solve this problem versus what do I need to know about this topic. Again, they're present-oriented and not future-oriented. And so again, what we're looking at is things that will help me right now, not just, things you need to know for life. The other big difference is, adult motivation is typically internal. So if somebody's pursuing knowledge as an adult, it's because it's of personal interest to them, as opposed to this is just a topic in school you just have to know, which is an external motivator. The book does talk about learning styles, and so people have preferred learning styles with preferences for content, methods of delivery, the environment, and the specific techniques. And this includes different cognitive factors, affective or feeling factors, and environmental factors. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with these different learning styles. Now, as the book talks about, right, these are preferences, but that doesn't mean people can't learn using other styles. So you've got learning by reading or watching. This is your classic visual. Hands-on being tactile or kinesthetic. And then listening, right, or auditory learners who like to hear things. In addition to the classic three quote-unquote learning styles of how people like to receive information, there's also other factors that determine how people can best learn. So for example, extroverts do best in a group environment for learning. So for example, studying by themselves, not a great tool versus being in a group and discussing something. Introverts prefer to listen, go away, and then try out the learning. Sensors need facts and details, and intuitives instead would prefer the big picture, which is the infamous, where is this all going? How does this all fit into the bigger whole? Thinkers need brief, concise, logical information, the infamous, just the facts, ma'am. Feelers want a positive experience, so again, building that success. Judgers, right, believe that rules give structure, and perceivers believe that self-monitoring can be too structured. So with our learning styles, again, we want to observe how a person learns, and we can ask about their preferences. Would they prefer reading the material or watching a demonstration video? Does speaking with them and listening help? Do they actually want to try and attempt it? So for example, with a glucometer in the hospital, I can give you the instructions. You can watch a video on someone doing it. You can have me explain it, and you can try it on yourself, right, or on a dummy. So again, we want to offer information in a variety of ways, but realizing that the style may vary with the situation and based on the information being presented. So a teaching style, this is the sum of what the teacher does, and the teaching style can be teacher-centered or learner-centered. So again, teacher-centered based on what the teacher is best at, and learner-centered, right, adapting content or attempting to adapt content based on what they believe the learner is going to most benefit from. And so one of the most obvious examples is do we teach in the same way that we were taught or the way that we prefer? So a lot of times, right, if people grew up with PowerPoint, they're going to use PowerPoint. If they grew up with traditional lecture, chalkboards, etc., they're likely to carry that on, and so forth. Now the text also talks about the 16 habits of mind, and these are on page 270. And so again, this is from a text, though, learning and leading with habits of mind, so essential characteristics for success. And this is things like persisting, managing impulsivity, thinking flexibly, right? So again, just how to manage your thoughts or things to keep in mind to be successful. Next, the text talks about the diffusion of innovations, which is how new ideas and practices are communicated and spread to members of a social system, and the process by which adults adopt new ideas and practices. Although this discussion actually can go into products and other things. So I think that's one of the easiest examples for looking at the diffusion of innovation and the innovation decision process. For example, we'll just talk about an iPhone. So you have to have knowledge of the innovation. So again, you become aware of this new device or this new concept or teaching method. And then persuasion. So again, we form a favorable attitude to why is this iPhone better than our current phone, or why is this teaching technique better. We make the decision to adopt or reject. So we decide to buy the iPhone, we adopt. We begin using the iPhone, and then we have confirmation of the decision or confirmation of this new technique, where again we see reinforcement and we make an evaluation over time and we say, wow, this phone does work really well. And we have confirmation that this was a good decision or a good teaching technique based on feedback from the class, etc. And so innovations are readily adopted if they provide an advantage over current practices, so the iPhone was better than its predecessors, are compatible with current beliefs, values, habits, and practices. So again, it was just something the phones were already doing, like texting, but better, and combining it with music. So again, it's compatible with current beliefs. Again, if I believe that this teaching technique doesn't sound too far out there, and you're like, oh, that makes sense, that would work. They're simple. Again, I create an innovative teaching technique, or the iPhone, which is just a very simple point-click interface. It can be tried, or trialability. You can go to the Apple Store and try the iPhone, or I can try a new teaching technique at first in a small group. And it can be observed, so again, I can see the outcomes, or I can actually see the phone in action, and then people go, yep, I'm confirming my decision, and I am purchasing that. And then lastly, the text talks about technology as a learning tool, where again, the technology should be learner-centered, which makes sense, right? Is that the idea is, especially if an individual user or learner is using it, it seems obvious that this would be much more learner-focused. And the software application should allow the learner to engage in sense-making, process management, reflection, and articulation. So again, this is not just for fun, but software that's specifically being used for teaching and learning. Again, you're going to ask the learner to do more than simply just read the text, right? In which case, that's just an online book. That's not actually software teaching someone. And with that being said, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.